So I was just saying, I was going to start off by giving some background on how I think about identifiability, get a few kind of pictures in place. So identifiability is basically this question of theory choice. So we have some collection of kind of candidate theories, and you might call these models or hypotheses. And then there's some mapping that describes how those theories would lead to observation that we see. So this is kind of even outside of causality and representation learning. This is how people think about identifiability in terms of partial differential equations and a lot of scientific application. So the question of model identifiability is in particular, can I go from this space of observations that I'm seeing? This could be something like probability distributions, or if we're in a finite sample setting, matrices of observed data, back to a theory in a unique way. So is there a unique theory that's going to fit our observed data? We might also care not about the whole theory, but just predictions of that theory. These could also be called parameters, kind of parameters or functionals in statistics, queries we might think about in causality, asking about what the effect of a certain intervention is going to be. And that's kind of all we care about when we're asking a question about which model we learn. So this would be called parameter identifiability. So for a certain parameter, do all the theories that fit our observed data give that same prediction? And we've been having some nice conversations here about why we should care about identifiability. I think we need to make this point a little bit better than we're currently making it, both at an intuitive level. Also, I think there's some interesting theoretical work to be done about what identifiability allows us to do in terms of extrapolation or generalization to new domains. So in particular, if you're from more of the machine learning community, you think about model robustness. Part of the problem with model robustness, this is for natural distribution shifts, you can also think of adversarial examples, is that when we're trying to generalize to new distributions, we somehow need to identify kind of the non-spurious features from the spurious ones. In healthcare, we may care about extrapolating to novel patient populations, which requires not just identifying the precise average treatment effect, but a conditional average treatment effect. And if we're asking about questions in biology, which is mostly what I think about, if we're trying to predict the effect of a drug like Excedrin in a cell type that we haven't seen before, or we haven't tested that drug in before, say like brain cells, then we're going to have to identify some form of interaction between how drugs and cells relate to each other. So we have a little bit about that type of extrapolation from a causal perspective in one of the works, which I won't go into today. So what happens, hopefully that's a little bit about why we care about identifiability, and we can, develop that kind of motivation further as a field. But say, you buy that, we care about identifiability. What if our model or the parameter that we care about is not identifiable? What options do we have on the table? So first, of hopefully not too many problems with the animations here. So say that we have this setup that's not identifiable. One of the approaches that we might take in order to make the problem identifiable is what I call a restriction approach. So we consider a smaller space of theories. I mean, if you go completely to one end of the spectrum, if you only have one theory, it's trivially identifiable, right? And we'll go into how some prior works in kind of the representation learning space are kind of instances of this kind of approach. The other approach would be an expansion approach. So instead of trying to restrict ourselves in terms of the space of theories, we're actually going to kind of blow up the space of observations and say that we observe more about the system. And this might be, in particular, what I'm thinking about today is like the system across different interventions or different distribution shifts, different contexts, where there's more data that's going to be helpful when we're going back to the theory. So the types of theories or models that I work with primarily are structural causal models. So this is kind of one of the flavors of causal models that are pretty prominent. So we're going to be working with directed acyclic graphs. This means there's kind of no feedback loops. So this might not be the best model if you're thinking about gene regulatory networks or something where there are feedback loops. But this is one of the most well-studied model classes, one of the ones that we know the most about, and kind of a starting place to ground intuitions about more complex model classes like cyclic models. And we'll get into how we might change these models to allow for, say, bidirected edges, which can model other forms of confounding that DAGs don't directly model. But okay, we're starting with DAG model G, and we're going to define a set of equations, and that's going to be what we call the structural causal model with that causal DAG. So for each of the variables, say Z1 through ZD, we're just going to have these in one-to-one correspondence with nodes in the DAG model. We're going to get a causal mechanism. So some kind of, you can think of this as kind of a line of code that says how that variable is being generated from its parents. And because of this topological ordering that you have for a DAG, you can really think about this as a computer program where you're just stepping through lines of code, writing down each variable as this function of its parents in the DAG model, as well as this exogenous noise term. And we're going to assume that these are mutually independent, so that a causally sufficient kind of DAG model. And we're going to get into cases where these might not be mutually independent later on. And we're going to introduce some notation for the set of causal DAGs, or for the set of structural causal models that have an underlying causal DAG G as this math frac of M of G. So once we have a causal model, we can define what we mean by interventions on a causal model. So an intervention is going to consist of a set of intervention targets. These are nodes that the intervention is affecting, as long as a set of interventional mechanisms, one associated to each of the intervention targets. And all an intervention does is takes kind of one line of this computer program and replaces it by a different line. And we can call that new causal model that we get from the intervention by this script M of I. And this is just a note about kind of the terminology I prefer to use for interventions. This is, to the best of my knowledge, like not totally standardized across the field. So I'm trying to give alternative terminologies that people use. But what I'm talking about here, where we literally are allowed to arbitrarily change the mechanism of the variable we're intervening on, call that a soft intervention. More specific form of intervention that actually cuts off the dependence on the parent. So CZ1 is not in the function anymore. That's going to be called a perfect intervention. And we're going to still allow, in the way I use perfect intervention, we'll also call these hard interventions. We're going to allow dependence on this exogenous noise term. So Z2 can still have some stochasticity. And the kind of most old school, most well-studied form of interventions, or just do interventions where we're just setting the target to a constant value. So this is really going from most general to least general. The way I prefer to use the terminology is that soft interventions include perfect interventions, include do interventions. So it's not like soft intervention somehow implies that you have to keep the dependence on the parents. If you want to be like very strict about that, you could say like a soft but not perfect intervention. But all the results I'm going to be talking about when I say soft intervention, they're going to equally well apply to like perfect interventions and do interventions, just as special cases. So if we have, now we want to think about multiple interventions at once. So we have some set of intervention targets. I'm going to denote this set math frac M sub I of G as a set of all tuples of SCMs, where each one of those obeys the structural causal model. or is a structural causal model that's consistent with this graph G. And then if we take one of these structural causal models, its difference from M0 is precisely in the form of an intervention on the intervention targets, TK. So a kind of a typical element of that set would look like this. If we had the intervention targets being 2, then we're allowed to change. And then with that intervention, 1 and D, we're changing those up to this last K intervention. So we're gonna, this is one model class that we're gonna be considering as well, which is not just single SEMs, but whole kind of sets of SEMs or tuples of SEMs that are associated with intervention targets. So now let's talk a little bit more, now that we know about structural causal models, about questions that come up in identifiability in terms of causality. So I like to kind of roughly divide work in causality into kind of 3 types of domains. So the first domain I would call a causally familiar domain. This is one where you might have domain experts or kind of common sense that means that you know kind of the variables that you care about in healthcare setting. You might know you care about different patient demographics, as well as the treatment that they're getting and some health outcome, and those kind of predefined variables in your data set that you're working with. You also know how those variables are causally related to each other. What I worked on more is in causal structure learning, which I would describe as pertaining to conceptually familiar domains. So these are domains where we might not know the causal relationships between the variables. So we might have a gene regulatory network that we want to learn, but we kind of have the variables themselves. We already know the kind of structure that the variables that we want to learn the structure over. A point I like making about kind of gene regulatory networks and learning those is that even having domain experts that can really tell you kind of what the relevant variables are is, you know, no small feat. That like took hundreds of years of development in biology to really pin down genes as the notion of like concept that we want to deal with, and develop technologies that exactly measure those concepts. And, you know, maybe they don't even exactly measure those, they measure some proxies and so on. And then finally, to really apply causality to all forms of domains and kind of, you know, modern data sets, I think we need to move into kind of conceptually novel domains where we might need to also learn kind of the causal variables. And I'm kind of preaching to the choir with this group here. So, you know, this is an important problem that many people are interested in studying. So to start off with like a type of problem that's identifiability problem that people care about in kind of these causally familiar domains, you might think of instrumental variable regression, where we observe the variables W, which is an instrument, as well as a treatment A and an outcome Y. Say that we're using linear structural causal models, so we're restricting the dependence in the causal mechanisms to be linear. So we're going to have kind of this space of 4 real valued parameters, as well as these distributions here. That's going to be the space of models that we're considering. What we're going to see in terms of our observation are these marginal distributions. And then what we care about might be something like the treatment effect, this coefficient beta AY. In causal structure learning, we'll start off with causal structure learning from just observational data. So the types of models that we would be considering are, say, the set of all DAGs on P nodes. So we know that we got P variables. And we are considering, you know, these tuples of DAG along with a structural causal model that is consistent with that DAG. All we see is kind of the induced observational distribution from the structural causal model. And then causal structure learning asks the question of whether we can figure out this parameter, which is the graph. So here's some kind of the foundational works in the field of causal structure learning from observational data. Now, we might not have full identifiability of this causal graph G unless we place further restriction on the distributions or the functional forms of the mechanisms. So that's one kind of popular approach to getting better identifiability, is to say, okay, I'm only going to consider models where it's a linear equation plus non-Gaussian norms or something like that. If we don't want to do that, then we're only going to be identifiable up to an equivalence class, which is called Markov equivalence class in this field. Basically, these are the DAGs that imply the same conditional independence in the distribution P of X. So one way to improve the identifiability that we get there, say we're starting off with the case of known intervention targets. So we have this list. We know that we've intervened. I'm always going to include the empty set so that we have some observational data. And we know we've intervened on targets T1 in the first intervention up through TK in the kth intervention. So this is a little bit more complicated looking now, but the set of models that we're going to be considering are these tuples, the graph. We have structural causal models, and the structural causal models are consistent with that kind of predefined notion of structural causal models plus interventions that I defined a few slides ago. And then instead of just seeing a single distribution, at least this is all kind of talking about the infinite data case, we're going to see tuples of distributions. We're going to see an observational distribution and then one distribution for each of the interventional distributions. Then we're asking, what can we identify? So there's a bunch of work on saying what we identify is now this interventional Markov equivalence class. And those also have kind of these nice graphical characterizations that mirror kind of the graphical characterizations of Markov equivalence that we had in the observational set. So you noticed I was saying that we had a set of known intervention targets there, but in reality, we often don't know all the targets of the intervention. Really what brought us to kind of this work was thinking about CRISPR, which is well known to have off-target effects. So kind of direct effects on genes that it wasn't supposed, the actual technology was not designed to have a direct effect on. We might not know which genes that they're targeting. So one kind of solution to this problem, which seems too nice and simple at first glance, but kind of actually works out, is to just treat the interventions as additional variables. So if we treat it as a binary 0-1 variable, we'll introduce this zeta 1 to say that this is a sample, say from intervention 1, then we can write down a structural causal model now involving 3 variables, where this second variable takes on the causal mechanism associated with the observational setting, if zeta 1 is equal to 0, and the causal mechanism associated with the interventional setting, zeta 1 equals 2. And then the kind of interpretation here is that the children of the intervention variable are going to correspond to the targets of the intervention. So the places where we need it to show up in the structural causal model. Just another quick note about the interpretation here is that basically, if we're trying to read off conditional independence statements from the graph, these are going, if they involve intervention variables, they're now going to correspond to conditional invariances. So in this graph, for those of y'all who know D separation, Z1 is be separated from zeta 1 if we're not conditioning on anything. So we would that would imply that Z1 and zeta 1 are independent, same since it's just binary value as that statement. And that's true if and only if, we're just kind of shuffling notation around that the observational marginal distribution for Z1 states. So this is capturing the intuition that if we intervene on Z2, it's only going to affect Z2 and anything that's downstream of that, which in this graph is nothing. It's not going to affect Z1. So this suggests, we can just kind of repurpose existing methods for causal structure learning by just adding in these kind of intervention variables. But we do need to be a bit careful. So we need to handle these intervention variables in a specific way because we have some background knowledge about them. In particular, we know that they're exogenous, kind of our original system variables. So this should say they have no system variables as parents. right? So they're always upstream of the system variables. And then this is a bit of a tricky one, but basically you can say, okay, if I know that a sample comes from intervention K, then it can't come from intervention K prime not equal to K. So there's kind of this mutual exclusivity of these variables, which means you should really model them. It's kind of a fully connected graph or do something to account for the fact that there's this deterministic relationship between them. One way that I think works out kind of cleanly to do that is just introduce like another indicator variable that now can take on values 0 through K. And these just kind of read off what value they're supposed to take. So if this was equal to 3, then zeta 3 would be equal to 1, and these variables would be equal to 0. So this is the work that we are kind of discussing. Those were kind of like ideas that go into this work. So those come from papers before this particular work. The problem now is if I have an existing causal structure learning algorithm that works with just observational data, can I ensure that it still works when I incorporate this form of background knowledge? So the algorithm that we study in this paper is the greedy sparse permutation algorithm. Just to give a little bit of an overview of the intuition behind this algorithm, instead of performing a search over the full space of DAG, it's going to perform a search over the space of permutations or node orderings. And to each one of those permutations, you can associate one graph, which is the minimal IMAP. And all that you need to know about this graph, it's basically the minimality means it's the sparsest graph of all graphs that are kind of consistent with this permutation, where it still fits the data. So IMAP means that it fits the data in the sense that every conditional independent statement implied by the graph is also a conditional independent statement in the data. So this is kind of this, if you had a predefined permutation, it's very easy to just get a minimal IMAP by going kind of step by step through that permutation and regressing, the variable and the all the variables that come before it in the permutation, doing some sort of sparse regression or conditional independence testing to say, okay, I do need these variables as parents, but I don't need these. So this method is based around this kind of insight, which comes from even some works in like the early 2000s, that if we knew the permutation, then the causal structure learning problem would be pretty easy, at least computationally, if not also statistically. So to demonstrate this, what if our true graph is this G star, where we have Z1 and Z2 pointing into Z3? So now, consistent ordering for this graph is 1, 2, 3 or 2, 1, 3. What if we pick an inconsistent order, 2, 1, 3? What if we can pick an inconsistent ordering like 2, 3, 1? Well, the sparsest the minimal IMAP is going to have some additional edge. In particular, you're always going to have these edges, Z2, Z3, or an edge between Z2 and Z3 and an edge between Z1 and Z3. You kind of can't get rid of those because those are those variables in the true graph are kind of right next to each other. There's no way to separate them. But we're going to get this extra edge from Z2 to Z1 because essentially, if you were missing it, you would be getting a conditional independent statement Z2 is in Z1 given Z3, which is not this original graph. Again, this is based on D separation. And the way that the method operates is essentially you start off, there's good initialization methods to get at least somewhat of a sparse initial permutation. You can do this by some techniques that are used in say like graph theory and numerical linear algebra. So kind of finding like a minimum degree ordering. It doesn't matter if none of those words make sense to you. You can really think of this as starting at any graph. It can just hand you a random permutation and just start there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are called covered edges in that graph. So these are edges where both of the variables essentially have the same parent. or set of parents. Of course, this variable is a parent of that variable. So we're going to have to do just some subtracting off that set there. That's going to be our definition of covered edge. And the nice thing about covered edges is that they kind of allow us to explore within a Markov equivalence class. So this is a nice characterization of Markov equivalence, that any two graphs which are Markov equivalent have a path of covered edges between them. It's an if and only if state. So say I flip this covered edge, then I'm going to get a new ordering. So now this graph is consistent with the ordering 2, 1, 3. And then I'm going to kind of rerun this process to figure out what the minimal IMAP associated with that permutation is. I notice now I can remove the edge from 2 to 1, and that puts me in a new Markov equivalence class. In this case, it's a small toy example. We've already found the correct graph, but in practice, we can keep iterating this procedure, kind of expanding out, searching within a Markov equivalence class. You can do this by like a depth first search. And then once we get to something where we can remove edges, we remove those edges, we end up in a new Markov equivalence class, and we repeat. Yep. Yeah, so we will stop. Basically, the stopping condition is when there is no graph in the Markov equivalence class of this one, which you can remove an edge from. So it's kind of like a local minimality condition. In this case, it's like, this is the only graph in the Markov equivalence class. So the stopping condition here is kind of trivially met, but sometimes you'd get a big Markov equivalence class if it wasn't identifiable, right? And then you would look at all of those and say, there's no graph in here where I can remove an edge. So an important thing about this process is that this greedy search is actually consistent. So again, talking about things in kind of the infinite data regime, where we're able to exactly get these conditional independence tests and establish what the minimal IMAP would be for each of these permutations. So essentially, this is a kind of similar result in the field. It's also what makes greedy equivalent search work, is that there's no local minimum. So one way of stating that is that if we have any graph G, which is an IMAP of, say, this true graph G star, then there's going to be a sequence of covered edge reversals, that take us within a Markov equivalence class and edge deletions from that G to the G star. And in honor of the author, we call this Chickering sequence. So what has to be done in this paper is basically establish the existence of interventional Chickering sequences. So if we start with permutation over these intervention variables plus these system variables, where all interventions are kind of all before the system variables, as we know they should be from this exogeneity condition, then we never have to kind of screw that up and like go in the opposite direction and put a system variable before in this ordering of one of the intervention variables. So, we basically analyze the construction of Chickering sequences in this paper and show that that construction, you can still construct one in this interventional way. And then code this method is implemented in this library that I was better about working on a few years ago and have so far not been as good about working on, but it has some nice stuff in there. So Causal DAG, if you're interested in at least some starter code for generating graph data and running these methods, this can be a useful package. And in the paper we study, here I'm showing some results on synthetic data. We also study the Sachs protein signaling network, which is kind of one of the commonly studied networks in causal structural learning. So there's at least some consensus on what the ground truth is there. But on the synthetic data here, with 0 off-target effects, scale the number of samples from 5,000. So the legend isn't until the last slide, but our method UT-IGSP does the best. And compared to IGSP, which is a version of this method where you assume that the intervention targets are known. And GIS, which is an interventional version of the greedy equivalent search method by Chickering. So this GIS is by Hauser and Bowman in 2012, kind of one of the first, not exactly one of the first works, one of the first more scalable works towards learning with intervention. There's some other stuff going back to Bayesian methods from kind of the early 2000s. And then as we increase the number of off-target effects, this method really starts outperforming those other methods because those methods are not specified for this setting, whereas ours is. There's been more updates to this sort of work, I think, differentiable versions of learning with unknown targets that may be even performing better now. So beyond learning with interventions, I'll also talk a little bit about the problem of learning in the presence of unobserved variables. Maybe now I should stop and take a question or two if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. I'm also happy to save questions for the end. So for learning in the presence of unobserved variables, kind of traditional missing data problem, we often don't have measurements of kind of all of the relevant causal variables. And there's many different approaches to dealing with this. So something that I mentioned kind of earlier on is that we might consider, instead of using these DAG models, which kind of implicitly assume that we observe all of the variables, we might switch to other types of graphical models. So there's a bunch of different types of mixed graph models. Here you'll get into like an acronym zoo of ADMGs and MAGs and MDAGs, and it's hard to keep track of exactly what the difference is between all of these. But I think the methods I have here, the first two work with maximal ancestral graph models, which basically are DAGs where you're allowed to have bidirected edges. And this other final paper that I list here allows for at least some class of acyclic directed mixed graphs, which also allow bidirected edges, but you're allowed to have kind of two edge types between pairs of variables. One of the problems with this approach is if you have a lot of latent variables, then this can kind of quickly get to like, you're just going to have bidirected edges between all of your observed variables. You're not really going to be able to learn anything relevant from the data. So this leads to some other approaches. One that we've studied is this kind of deconfounding approach. If you have a latent variable that affects many of the observed variables, so we call this pervasive confounding, and that actually kind of gives you some signal in your data of, all of these, they almost have this kind of low rank structure where you're able to say you looked at like a PCA plot of this, almost all of the covariation between these variables would be explained by kind of one principal component corresponding basically to that latent variable. That's basically the right thing to think about in the linear setting, which is what's studied in this work. So that's low rank plus sparse. And then they, after doing this kind of low rank sparse processing, they run GES. And then we address a nonlinear setting where things get a little bit more complicated. You have to use basis functions to kind of identify how many kind of principal components per latent variable you kind of need to take into account. And that's in recent work, soon being published in JRSSB. And then the approach that I'm going to talk about today is going to use a kind of different low rank structure that's induced by the latent variables. And this is again going to be motivated by some problems in biology, joint work of these people, and he who's also a co-first author of this paper. So what were we inspired by? We were basically looking at this phenomenon of transcription factories. These are different than transcription factors. So transcription factors are kind of known to regulate gene expression of several downstream genes. transcription factories are basically at least these hypothesized kind of locations in the nucleus where there's some data backing these hypotheses up, where kind of transcription factors come together, and then from there they kind of use that as a locus to kind of co-regulate the expression of a bunch of genes. So we have this kind of picture in mind where like the Z1, Z2, and Z3 might be transcription factors that come into this transcription factory and then area and then regulate Z4, Z5, and Z6. So to kind of understand what we're doing here, we're going to introduce a little bit of terminology that's going to kind of expose the low rank structure that these types of models might have. So those familiar with graphs might already know some things about deseparation and how paths between variables relate to deseparation. So there's kind of an extended version of this that's called track separation. So instead of a path, we're going to be dealing with a tuple of paths. So for instance, if you have this one path, Z1 through this factory, Z4, then the second in this pair of tuples, Z1 factory to Z5, then the important thing about that tuple of paths is that they share the same source node, Z1. So we would call that, so this should be Z5, but we would call this a trek from between Z4 and Z5. And you can essentially use these to express what the covariance between nodes are in the linear case. So the definition of trek separation, and it's just going to be a specialized version. There's kind of a more general notion that doesn't involve just a single node, but like a tuple of sets of nodes, but we're not really going to need that. So we're just going to say a single node F trek separates or T separates a set of nodes A, a set of nodes B, if all treks kind of between pairs of nodes, and those sets have to pass through F. So for instance, in this picture, this factory here will T separate the set Z4, Z5 from all of the tracks go through here. And the track separation theorem, we can kind of think of as a generalization of, in deseparation, we ask, given separation statements in the graph, what does that, in an area setting, what does that imply about covariances or partial correlations in our data? This is going to tell us about some structure in the covariance matrix. In particular, if there's a single node that T separates A and B, then the rank of the covariance matrix, which has rows in A and columns in B, is going to be 1. And that's going to be kind of a way of identifying some structure in the graph, because there's no node, no single node that separates that. Well, this should be is greater than 1, not equal to 2. But yeah, if there's not a node T separating them, then this rank 1 thing will not apply. And this is in a generic setting, so this requires some form of faithfulness assumption where you say, the parameters don't kind of strangely cancel out. So to kind of take advantage of these structures, in this paper, we propose latent factor causal models, which are kind of a generalization of that picture. Some of the conditions that we need are that each variable belongs to a unique cluster, so only has a single latent parent. The graph is bipartite, so there's no edges between either latent variables to another latent variable or from an observed variable to an observed variable. And then we're going to use some graphical conditions as well on how many kind of latent variables, how many children each latent variable needs, and how many parents each of the latents needs. So if we have a latent variable here, and a latent variable here that have kind of path between them, we're going to need 2 things on that path between them instead of just 1. And that's kind of going to go into this rank testing. So the method works essentially by saying I have Zi and Zj are going to be in the same bottommost cluster if they're T-separated from kind of all the rest of the nodes just by a single node. And it's an if and only if statement. So then we can use this rank testing to identify them. So basically we find these bottommost clusters, we kind of peel those off, forget about them, look at the marginal covariance matrix when we remove those nodes. We do that again. This is now the bottommost cluster. We do that again. And then the rest of this is kind of basically cleanup. So there's a problem here that we've kind of split these two variables into a different cluster. We can handle that by this kind of merging step. And then we basically, take these clusters and we already kind of know the directions between them. And then we just need to add in kind of the appropriate edges. So that's all I want to say about that work. I'll try to speed through the work on experimental designs that can talk a bit about causal disentanglement. So in work on experimental design, we're asking how many interventions does it require to learn a causal graph, and can we kind of learn a causal graph in as few interventions as possible? So in this work, which is kind of very graph theoretical, I did during summer at IBM, we kind of looked at previous works which established these kind of worst case lower bounds over kind of all DAGs in a Markov equivalence class. And they kind of use that to measure how difficult a kind of intervention design problem is, and argue that this is not necessarily a good measure of the difficulty of this problem, because you might have different graphs in these equivalence classes that may be much harder to learn than others. So we kind of want an instance-wise notion of difficulty, like for each graph, how difficult is it to learn that graph? So we go through and define this measure M of G as the size of the smallest intervention set. Here we're considering single node interventions that fully identifies the graph. So for instance, if we had a tree, then one intervention is always sufficient for identifying the graph. All I have to do is intervene on the root node, and then I will figure out, okay, everything else is basically downstream of that variable because none of the marginals change and there's no other edges to learn. And this is to contrast with the fact that if you don't know this graph ahead of time, kind of the best you can do is this sort of bisection search, where you choose like the most central node in the tree and intervene on that. And then, you might have like kind of half the graph not identified and you have to keep going. So the optimal design for this is going to take log the number of node interventions. So there's kind of this gap between if you were kind of this this teacher who knows G and you were teaching a student, you were saying, hey, intervene on the root node of this tree. That's only going to take one intervention, versus like if you're just going it on your own and you're not getting any instruction, you just are trying to learn it for yourself. So there's this log difference there. And essentially, we're coming up in this paper with characterization of this quantity M of G using a generalization of clique trees of undirected quartile graphs. So we generalize these to DAG models, and that allows us to kind of establish this uniform lower bound over this whole class. And we are also able to propose a intervention policy, which is within this kind of logarithmic factor that we know is the best that you can do of the true minimal kind of number of interventions that a teacher would be able to tell you in order to identify this. And we only approve this for a restricted class, but Javin Chu and others have a generalization of this to unrestricted classes of DAGs. So finally, I'll get to my work on causal disentanglement. So this is kind of back at that base level of the kind of pyramid that I showed earlier, where we're considering kind of conceptually novel systems. So when I'm talking about a causal disentanglement model, I'm saying that there are some latent variables that are connected by a known causal graph. You don't get to observe those. I'll call those macro variables. We can kind of think of these as like these abstract high-level concepts. What we observe instead is simply this change of variables through a mixing function. It's also unknown. And instead we see some more high-dimensional micro variables, maybe something like an image. So this is motivated, in cellular biology, we could think of the macro variables as being these things describing the intrinsic state of the cell. So something like the concentration levels of various proteins or aspects of like the cellular morphology, where different organelles are located and so on. And then the micro variables might be something like fluorescent microscopy images, gene expression, pick your favorite modality. In neuroscience, I've been thinking about how this might apply a little bit. Long-term vision would be to also address that as an application, but your macro variables might be some things like neurotransmitter concentrations or like the reuptake rates of different neurotransmitters. And then your micro level data, your observed data might be something like a neuroimaging experiment or electrical activity. So going back to, this is a really complicated model. A lot of things can be going on. If you kind of make no restrictions on it, it's not going to be identifiable. So what are some approaches to identifiability? We discussed this restriction approach and this expansion approach. So kind of one of the most classical ways of dealing with this is a restriction approach where maybe you just restrict the space that your latent variables might live on. So you might just only allow for your latent variables to be independent. You only allow for product distributions. That would get you something just with a linear function, traditional ICA, or a lot more recent works on nonlinear ICA, if you allow for a general nonlinear mixing function. Another approach that's been taken in a lot of work on learning latent DAG models is to restrict the mixing function. So in particular, place like some form of structural restrictions, some sparsity restrictions. So you don't allow for, in particular in some of these works, they say for each of the latent variables, there might be one observed variable that is only a function of that latent variable. It's called like a pure child or an anchor. So if we don't want to take kind of one of these things, if we say, okay, maybe I'm trying to deal with images where, any pixel might really be a function of all of the observed variables. I don't want to rule that out ahead of time. And I actually want to allow for some causal structure in the latent space. Then one of the approaches that we could take is to instead expand the set of data that we're going to have access to. So we're going to incorporate data from multiple contexts. In particular, we're kind of studying interventions. So this is, all these papers are from 2023. Some of them are still under submission. So our paper that I'll talk about is this top one, but this is kind of to try to give you a lay of the land. We're considering this setting where both the latent model is linear and the mixing function is linear. And this has already been generalized to allowing the mixing function to be non-parametric, allowing just the latent model to be non-parametric, even both with some caveats of like kind of the traditional setting that the rest of these works are in, only working for 2 latent variables, and you need to kind of add more if you want to go beyond 2 variables. It's a very active line of work. When I say linear mixing, I just want to point out that this work of Ahuja et al. Basically gives a way of extending any result for linear mixing to polynomial mixing under some conditions on these polynomials that I won't get into here. So beyond kind of what types of models in latent space and what mixing functions we consider, something else to pay attention to is what types of interventions these different works consider. Highly recommend having Jachi here sometime to talk about this work, which actually works for soft interventions, which I think so far is the only one that works for that. Some of these other papers do have results on soft interventions, but you don't get full identifiability of the graph in these other papers. So you have to kind of make appropriate types of faithfulness assumptions to rule out some cases. And finally, to note, all of these papers are only using interventions of size 1. So I'll point out that, that's one of the main kind of open problems to extend to larger sizes of interventions. So this is work joint first author with Anna Siegel, who's Harvard applied math. And the setup is that again, I'll just kind of lay it all out visually, that we have this linear mixing function for going from d dimensions to p dimensions. This has to be an injective function, so it has to have full column rank. And we have a linear model, so that's basically saying that the equations look like this form. Every variable is just a linear function of its parents plus the noise. And then we have single node interventions. So kind of to compactify these, we can write in each context K, D is equal to some matrix AK times D plus here. Traditionally, somebody might just write this independent noise term and say, okay, that's distributed according to like the normal 0 sigma K distribution. Here, it's just a little bit easier to parameterize by kind of pulling that out and assuming that this variable has covariance 1. Each one of those is covariance 1, the whole set is covariance, the identity, right? And then kind of re-expressing this, we can say that we pull this over to the other side and collect terms and invert, and we can say Z is equal to BK inverse times epsilon, where BK now contains information about both those noise terms, the variance of the noise terms, as well as the edge weights. And in our work, we're going to work with this being an upper triangular matrix. So you could consider basically identifiability up to some permutations. You can also just kind of fix a canonical ordering of your latent variables so that Z1 always comes before Z2 and so on. So you just kind of pin down that one indeterminacy. So that's going to imply this upper triangularity. And kind of the picture to have in mind is that we have this epsilon variable that gets changed into the Z variables. So exogenous noise becomes Z by multiplying by BK inverse. That becomes X by multiplying by G. And then if we want to just go back, we'll define H as G pseudo inverse. And the map back from Z to epsilon is going to be this BK. And that's going to give us a nice way of expressing this should be the pseudo, well, this is the inverse covariance. And then this is pseudo inverse covariance, but we start off with the identity, and kind of each time we go down, we just pick up on both sides like a conjugation by BK transpose and BK here, and then H transpose and H there. Yep. Yep. G, yeah, injunction. Yep. Yes. 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 Yeah, sorry. So the question was, is it true that in the setup, there's an injective function from epsilon to X, so that if we had X, we can actually identify the epsilon variable is, and that is true in the setup. So that's just both of these functions being injective, like in a normal linear equation model, you would have that injective, and then also in the G being injective. So yeah, we just compose those two injective maps. So I see that I'm already at the hour. I know we have the room booked for an hour and a half. If anybody has meetings or stuff and needs to go, I won't have my feelings hurt. But I think I have maybe 5 to 10 minutes left. So just a outline of kind of what we're doing here and a proof sketch of how we show that this model is identifiable. We have this input of take, for instance, just the inverse, the pseudo inverse covariance matrices. What we want to do is output kind of all of these parameters of the model. So we want to get this inverse mixing so that we can go back from the X's to Z's. And then we want to get each of these structural equation models. which are also going to implicitly identify what the intervention targets are just by looking at, okay, B1 changes to B0 in this row, therefore, that's what the intervention target was. So we have the system equations that we want to solve, and the theorem in the paper is that if we have one intervention per latent node, that is going to be sufficient to solve this system equation, and it's also in the worst case necessary. So if we're missing one of the interventions, we can pick a graph and we can pick which intervention that we're missing, such that this model is actually not identifiable. And here we're talking about model identifiability, so there's a lot more work to do on kind of partial identifiability, and like if you only care about certain parameters or predictions of the model, are those still identifiable? Right, so this is kind of, we're asking for the most here. This is kind of worst case result. So to prove that this is sufficient, basically what we do is we take this kind of row decomposition of a matrix. We just say, okay, we can express any matrix as just, you know, the sum of its rows plus like this padding. And you can use that then to say, if I take the product of like a matrix transpose times itself, I'm basically going to split this into a bunch of rank 1 terms. So this just means BD times BD transpose. So this will give you a rank 1 matrix. So our full matrix is the sum of these D rank 1 terms. And if we're looking at the observational distribution, interventional distributions, by assumption, these are only differing at one of the rows. So we're actually going to be able to write the difference. Now this is kind of in the latent state. We're going to write the difference between these as a rank 1 term, and then, or a difference of rank 1 terms. And then when we go from that latent space to the observed space, again, we're just going to kind of do this conjugation. So it's still going to be a difference between 2 rank 1 terms. So this kind of gives us a key identity that we're going to work with. In general, difference between 2 rank 1 terms would be rank 2. But we're going to basically, I'm going to speed through this a little bit, but we're going to use kind of observation that if the variable that we're intervening on is a source node, then these kind of rank 1 terms are actually going to align. So even though generically it would be of rank 2, in that special case where IK is a source node, this difference is going to be rank 1. So again, we can kind of figure out which interventions correspond to source nodes by doing this rank testing. And then we can also use that to basically recover a corresponding row of H, and we kind of rinse and repeat. So it does kind of have this flavor that you might have seen from the latent factor causal model work, where we kind of go, you know, either identify a sync node or identify a source node in this case, and kind of keep iterating. So our algorithm first uses rank testifying source nodes, recovers these corresponding rows of H, and then kind of rinse and repeat. So the kind of tricky thing here compared to the case of the observational setting is like when you're trying to do this operation of getting rid of the source nodes and just marginalizing them out, it's not kind of as straightforward because you don't know exactly what the representation of that source node should be yet. So we're going to kind of keep track of the rows of H that we've recovered, form a vector space out of those, and then we're going to project these differences onto the vector space. So they're not going to be rank 1. The differences aren't just going to be rank 1, they're going to be rank 1 after we project them onto the kind of right vector space. And a lot of the paper goes through some of the subtleties of like how you have to do this projection. We actually split this up into 2 steps. So we decompose H into kind of a generalization of you know, RQ or QR decompositions, where you have like a upper triangular matrix and an orthogonal matrix. we basically kind of generalize those, and we first recover the Q component. So we recover it up to like this orthogonal transformation, and then we recover up to we recover the R component. So when we recover it up to the right orthogonal transformation, we essentially already have the order right, but we might have kind of extra edges. And then when we do this additional transformation, we can get rid of those extra edges. So as I said, we also show worst case necessity. We do show a result in this paper for soft interventions, but we show that you can only recover the graph up to transitive closure. So transitive closure, I mean, you just add an edge from every ancestor to all of its descendants. So if I took with this graph, it's transitive closure, but add in the edge Z1 to Z3. We're not going to be able to distinguish between those two graphs. You can kind of go back and forth. And kind of in the new work I alluded to, it's basically the linearity of the structural causal model that's breaking this apart, because you can't kind of tell between linearity in the latent space and linearity of the mixing function. So yeah, highlighting some of our ongoing work on this. As I've said, we have a preprint out on guarantees for soft interventions and non-parametric latent structural causal models. This also introduces an algorithmic approach and has some applications where we try to extrapolate from kind of single gene knockout data to knockout data where 2 genes have been knocked out, and showing some instances where that works. And we also have some work with a slightly different flavor, where instead of considering multiple contexts which correspond to interventions, we study multiple modalities. So say Perturb-Seq and Attack-Seq. Often in bio, you can't get both of these modalities at once. You know, there are some assays which allow you to get 2 modalities at once, but once you scale up to 3 or 4, most of this data is going to be unpaired, since these assays destroy the cell. So it's important for that problem to study the unpaired setting. And in that work, we're kind of using this restriction approach, where we place some restrictions on the mixing function, a little bit weaker than found in previous works, kind of taking advantage of these multiple modalities. And we establish some statistical benefits of these multiple modalities beyond the fact that just there's kind of more data, but like kind of a real extra benefit from having multiple modalities. So I'll end with some open questions that are on my mind. I've said, you know, multi-node interventions would be one of the next places to take the theory here. In terms of method development, you know, the proof that we use in the paper is constructive, so you can turn that into a method and run it, but it wasn't really designed for the statistical efficiency of the method. And you know, I think score-based methods, because they come from this maximum likelihood framework, often have a little bit of a chance of better statistical performance. There's a variety of score-based methods. There's some work on exactly optimizing maximum likelihood score using stuff like integer linear programming. You know, when we're exactly maximizing likelihood, that's really nice, but it's also going to be really computationally expensive. So we can relax that. I've talked a little bit about greedy approaches, which still might have some consistency guarantees, but not necessarily, you know, those don't necessarily mean that they find the global optimum in like finite sample settings. And then kind of the most scalable methods are gradient-based methods, you know, people here have worked on, but, you know, you have these kind of optimization problems that I think we have to address. Finally, I'm interested in really applying this and kind of seeing where the theory needs to go to make this useful. And finally, end-to-end causal reasoning. So I think these kind of causal inference, causal structure learning, causal representation learning problems are often considered kind of separately. You know, you learn a causal structure and you hand it off to people who have algorithms that assume you know the causal structure. And that kind of breaks down because you are violating their assumptions by giving them this estimated structure, and really kind of carrying the statistical, computational, all of that analysis through to get the best results from the data, I think requires a lot of new work and new ideas. And if you want to know more about here's just some of the stuff I've done in space causality. I already mentioned the package. I think Jason mentioned the Causality Bootcamp. There's a lot of other great speakers there. Check that out. We have a review on a lot of the material in here on causal structure learning. And I taught a course during MIT's winter term that kind of really is trying to break it down into these 3 levels of representation learning, structure learning, and causal inference. So that's all I have. Thank you all for having me. And I guess we have like 20 minutes for questions. Be mean. Mhm. Oh, yes.
So you mentioned the
Yes. Mhm.
maybe why do you choose to work on these?
Mhm. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, repeat the question. Yes. So the question was, contrasting kind of these keeps going on. Contrasting these kind of more, maybe old school-ish computer sciencey type methods versus like machine learning gradient-based methods. What is the kind of motivation for working in these types of regimes rather than kind of these more scalable gradient-based method regimes? I think part of it is just the I'm not fully attached to that. I am very interested in gradient-based methods. Training is mostly in kind of computer science, where these other ways are like ways like kind of like learn to think about these things. See a lot of promise for these methods. One of the main things I'd be interested in gradient-based methods is, in deep learning, I guess we have this somehow nice geometry of the optimization landscape where like even though maybe the problem is like really non-convex, we often find really good local minima or global minima. Because we're starting off with this kind of really combinatorial problem, it seems to me like that intuition doesn't immediately translate over. So if we could have like kind of certificates of like how close to optimal those solutions are, or come up with ways of maybe smoothing that optimization landscape out so that we're more likely to actually reach those global minima. That would make me a little bit more comfortable if we're thinking about like giving these to people to use in practice. Another thing is, and this is maybe a longer discussion, but like as a field, like we do evaluate a lot of the results on synthetic data. And, there's already some work from like Alexander Rysock and others, Navir Ng, about how synthetic data might be kind of leading us astray in kind of the methods that we're developing. And one idea, we want this ground truth that we can measure against, but one idea is to just take the ways that we're generating synthetic data and make them more similar, kind of try to get rid of as many of the artifacts in that data generation process as possible. I think really when we start like applying it to applications and like giving these methods to people to run and like try to make conclusions and predictions from their data sets, if gradient-based methods are like working super well for them, we want to like focus on developing those. But if they if they understand this kind of optimization problem and are somehow skeptical of like what are the guarantees I'm actually getting for running this algorithm, am I going to be like kind of reading tea leaves, or is there something kind of more rigorously guaranteed here, then they might. Yeah, I'm making stuff up now. I don't. You have to ask somebody who knows it, but I'm worried they might not trust those types of approaches without a little bit more validation. Yeah. So we're gonna have something like this in the multi-node setting. So here we had a difference between two rank one terms. What we're gonna have if we have like B interventions is a difference between B rank, like we're gonna have B of these copies of these for each of the intervention targets. So that's still gonna be able to give us some signal kind of in terms of like reading off the rank, like maybe everything was a source node, then it would be rank B. If nothing was a source node, it'd be like rank 2B, and everything in between there. But in terms of our proof technique, it really relied on like you first identify a source, and like in a multi-node setting, there's don't necessarily, the whole thing might be identifiable, but all of your interventions might be like a source node and like a sink node, or like some weird combination of that. So I think, yeah, you have to almost maybe just solve the problem more kind of globally or simultaneously rather than being able to break it down into these chunks. But yeah, I think an approach would be for each single one of those interventions, maybe figure out what you identify, kind of like your work.